This is Module 4, where we'll focus on the third axis of social stratification, gender, and its relation to health. In this segment, we'll be talking just about a few basic concepts and terminology related to sex and gender. Before we do that, I just want to recognize that within this entire topic, we're talking about, again, an aspect of paradoxes. And most of the material that we'll be discussing today will be organized in light of that reality. So first, just a reminder of what we mean by paradoxes. Here we're talking about social disadvantage equating to health disadvantage as a rather axiomatic assumption in social epidemiology. And where we find deviations from this equation, we refer to them as paradoxes. Some of the examples of paradoxes that reflect this deviation from our expectations are, of course, black versus white patterns regarding affective disorders, as we saw with the James Jackson piece on depression among blacks and whites, and the differences in health outcomes and patterning between women and men is another example. Two other examples we won't be covering are the so-called immigrant paradox, referring to health advantages among the foreign-born relative to the native-born that are contrary to expectations because of the relative socioeconomic disadvantaged status of foreign-born individuals. And that is often sometimes generalized into a more broad paradox referring to Hispanics versus whites, where the health patterns and outcomes among Hispanics are in a sense better than what would expect relative to whites given their disadvantaged socioeconomic status. When we are confronted with these paradoxes, we have a couple of options. First, we can try to make them go away with better data, better methods. If we assume that what we're observing that is paradoxical is rather artifactual, some artifact of how we've operationalized the study, conducted the analyses, and so forth, and that what we're observing is not in fact the truth, but rather some apparent deviation from the truth that we just need to fix through better analysis and methodology. We can also try to make them go away with substantive explanations, whether they're social or biological. Or we can also reevaluate and adapt the paradigms that we're using in order to better reflect the reality. And one reason for this, of course, is when you're confronted with the possibility that when the exceptions to the so-called rules, to the expectations, start to outnumber instances that are confirming of the expectations or get to a certain tipping point, then at what point do you decide that we need to actually reevaluate or adapt the paradigm rather than just acknowledging or trying to make go away deviations from the dominant paradigm? Okay, so when we get into the difference, the first aspects of terminology is just the basic differences between these concepts of sex and gender. And sex is typically defined as a biological construct premised upon biological characteristics enabling or related to sexual reproduction, in contrast to gender, referring to a social construct regarding culture-bound conventions, roles, behaviors for, as well as relations between and among men and women and boys and girls. Gender roles varying across a continuum, and both gender relations and biological expressions of gender varying within and across societies, typically in relation to social divisions premised on power and authority. These are both definitions courtesy of Krieger. The first concept is this notion of a binary construction of sex and gender, and contemporary critics of discourse and scholarship around sex and gender often refer to the binary way in which these concepts are conceived, conceptualized, or treated in analysis. And by that we simply mean that there is an existence of an either-or construction of sex or gender, meaning that we have males or females and men or women, and that the treatments of gender in our discourse and in our research and so forth are ignoring the more continuous kinds of definitions and construction of gender that actually exist and that are seldom recognized or appreciated and incorporated into research. Another critique of contemporary usage of sex and gender references essentialism. Essentialist positions on sex and gender like those around sexuality, race, ethnicity, or other characteristics, tend to consider these to be fixed traits, which do not allow for variations among individuals or over time. The essence part of that implies, by definition, permanence and inalterability. And especially when used with reference to things like gender or race, is often conflated with a kind of biological reductionism. And that's what you see operating in times with the debates and the contrast between nature versus nurture. Others have argued that even biological sex, others like Monique Wittig, that biological sex is itself not even an essence, and that the body's physiology is itself implicated in a process of social construction. And you can see the social construction of sex operating in the assignment of sex to infants born with ambiguous genitalia or sexual organs, and it's part of the discourse of the intersex movement, arguing for greater recognition of and attention to the social nature of sex assignment and sex identity in the intersex movement. So in contrast to essentialist, biological determinist arguments, you have social construction notions we've already talked about with respect to race. And these theories or concepts consider basically how social phenomena of all kinds develop in social contexts. And there's a recognition there that any concept or practice is the creation or artifact of a particular group in a particular time in history. Patriarchy is, of course, another term that is often invoked in discussions of gender, and refers to types of social organization characterized by the supremacy of the father in the family historically and the legal dependence of wives and children on men, as well as the practice of descent and inheritance along the male line only. But more broadly, patriarchy can refer to control by men of a disproportionately large share of societal power. And we often see patriarchy encoded in laws related to divorce, age of marriage, abortion, penalties for rape, access to abortion in the context of rape, and so on. The concept of hegemony, unlike the others, may not be immediately obvious as a relevance to concepts of gender, but I think it will become clear later on why I'm including it in this list. Cultural hegemony is a concept cut through the work of Antonio Gramsci, particularly to explain why the so-called inevitable socialist revolution predicted by Marx did not occur or hadn't occurred by the early 20th century. What it refers to is a form of ideological soft social control, coercion, by which the ruling elites or capitalist class develop a kind of so-called consensus culture, where the working class identifies their best interests with the best interests of the ruling class. So again, in terms of the types of power the society has, in addition to things like force through physical arms, other types of economic power and coercion, this refers to more of a cultural type of coercion or control through the kinds of institutions that propagate ideology in society, through in contemporary culture, things like the press, the media, churches, labor unions, etc., who in effect propagate the ruling class's ideology and in essence create a kind of normative notion that the system of values, attitudes, beliefs that has the effect of supporting the status quo in power relations is in effect normal. And this prevailing consciousness is internalized such that the general population believes that the status quo is so common sense that there is no reason to challenge it or upend it. The social relations, the philosophy, the morality of the ruling classes or the capitalist elites comes to appear so natural, to be the natural order of things, that there would be no reason to question it otherwise. Since the essence and the efficacy of hegemony is in having the working class or those in the lower socioeconomic ranks identify their own interests with those of the elites, we can refer to one recent example of cultural hegemony in popular discourse around debates during the last presidential election in the U.S. focused on the 99% versus the 1% and the 0.01% of income inequality in the U.S. and around the relative social class locations of the two presidential candidates. and all the rhetoric that was around Fox News and other media outlets, referring to rich people not as rich people, but as the so-called job creators, is an example of an attempt to sort of prop up this ideologic normativity around the status quo, in effect by arguing that, hey, people need to be able to be extremely wealthy, and we need to have a system, a social organization that supports and allows for income inequality, because those elites are the folks who are creating the jobs that the folks in the lower classes need in order to make a living. And so there you see this attempt to align the interests between those enjoying the benefits of high income inequality relative to those at the bottom end of the inequality spectrum. In some ways, if hegemony is the way we define what is normal, natural, and right, and therefore should not be questioned, types of normativity are the ways we define what is not normal and natural and right, and that can be with reference to gender constructions, but also to heterosexuality. Adrian Rich's concept of compulsive heterosexuality is a form of heteronormativity, refers to how non-heterosexuality sexual orientations are marginalized through the expectations, demands, etc., of what we define as normal. And heteronormativity refers to practices and institutions that privilege heterosexuality, legitimize heterosexual relationships as fundamental and natural within society. Heteronormativity stems from a sort of essentialist construction of only two sexes, and that with those two sexes, only a certain set of behaviors and expectations are correct, and that reflects the binaries of man, woman, gay, straight, and sets them in opposition to each other. Heterosexuality in this construction is the only natural and correct form of sexuality. The close cousins of that are normativity related to masculinity and femininity, referring to the performance of gender and expressions of gender that are considered normative. Deviations from those normative expressions of masculinity and femininity are marginalized and often then assumed to reflect a non-hetero social construction or a lifestyle, and therefore deviance. Finally, when we talk about gender, we can trace an evolution that reflects a lot of evolution in feminist thinking, from the more binary to the more fluid, from the more essentialist to the more constructed treatments of gender. So earlier work has focused on attributes of individuals, men versus women, that were considered to be relatively static and essential, even if socially constructed through gender socialization. They were considered to be characteristics, traits of individuals, defined often in opposition to each other, that were kind of relatively permanent across the life course and across time and place as a function of entrenched practices around gender socialization, all the way through to more social construction of gender roles, as again reflecting the ways in which gender construction relates to broader organization around power and social organization of society around the labor market and the home workplace versus the domestic sphere and so forth. Relations treatments of gender really reflect a greater attention to the workings of power and the definitions of gender roles, characteristics, behaviors, gender norms in relation to each other, both among men and women and between men and women, and also in relation to power. And gender performance is a concept that really reflects the most sort of fluid social construction of gender. Weston Zimmerman's work on doing gender really refers to gender as a kind of routine accomplishment embedded in everyday interaction, referring to the fact that gender performance is something so fluid that it might be variable within individuals over the course of minute interactions, over the course of a day or longer time period, and of course in contrast to different social contexts. So with notions around gender performance, doing gender, you get an appreciation of how situated gender expression is. It's not something that is permanent, fixed over the life course, but actually among individuals might be a very evolving, worked out thing in construction over the course of the day-to-day interaction and over the life course. We can see how even in popular discourse and awareness, there is a growing recognition or rethinking around gender. Here's a quote from Newsweek back in 2007. A growing number of Americans are taking their private struggles with their identities into the public realm. How those who believe they were born with the wrong bodies are forcing us to re-examine what it means to be male and female. So here we get, even in popular discourse, a greater recognition of the issues around transgender, changes in gender identity, sex identity, and so forth. And of course, we had a couple of really high-profile examples of the ambiguity and the fluid nature of sex and gender identity. One was the case of the Olympic competitor Caster Semenya in South Africa, whose sex was questioned and her legitimacy as a competitor as a woman was questioned, and she was subjected to a lot of scrutiny and examination to determine if she was actually able to compete as a woman. And also Thomas Beattie, who was a F to M transgender male who ultimately wound up bearing 2 pregnancies with his wife and partner because he had never had a hysterectomy and retained the sexual organs necessary for reproduction. So he was actually able to bear 2 children. So this kind of imagery, which is often that which you see in sort of farcical movies and so forth, as a reality was very unsettling to many people, but also forced a kind of recognition of the reality of deviations from these very essentialist, static, binary constructions of sex and gender. That's the end of segment 1.